The first time my daughter-in-law asked me to sign away my house. She had already prepared the paperwork. She had it in a leather portfolio, folded once down the middle. My name printed neatly on the top line. She had coffee ready and pastries from the good bakery on Morrison Boulevard. She had practiced her smile, and she had practiced her words, and she had chosen a Sunday afternoon when my son, her husband, was conveniently somewhere else. What she had not prepared for was me. I spent 31 years as the Director of Fraud Risk Management at Piedmont Regional Bank in Charlotte, North Carolina. Wire fraud, internal embezzlement, mortgage fraud, schemes that took years to build and minutes to unravel once you knew what you were looking for. I have sat across the table from people who looked me in the eye and lied, without blinking, people who went to church on Sunday and coached Little League on Saturday and stole money on Tuesday with the calm efficiency of someone paying a utility bill. I knew every pattern, every tell, every move. I just never expected the next investigation would begin at my own son's dining room table. The coffee was always ready by 6:15. That was the one thing I never let slip. Even after Ruth was gone. The timer on the old Mister. Coffee machine, the same one we bought at a Sears clearance sale back in 2007, I kept it set to 6:15 every single morning. Ruth used to say I was the only man she knew who treated a coffee maker like a piece of military equipment. She wasn't wrong. But after she passed, that timer became something else entirely. It became proof that the morning still came, that the day still intended to begin. Whether I was ready for it or not, I would pour my first cup and carry it out to the back porch. Summer or winter, it didn't matter much. Charlotte mornings have a way of being gentle with you, even in January. The neighborhood was quiet at that hour. Just the sound of a few birds working out their opinions in the oak trees, and sometimes the distant hum of a garbage truck making its way down Pembroke Lane. I would sit in the old rocking chair, Ruth's chair, technically, though she never minded me using it, and I would hold that cup with both hands and just let the morning happen around me. 3 years into retirement, and I had finally stopped feeling guilty about it. That sounds like a strange thing to say. I know. But when you spend 31 years chasing numbers that don't add up, following paper trails through 3 states, sitting across from people who looked you right in the eye and lied without blinking, when that is your life for over 3 decades, you don't just walk away clean. You carry the habit of vigilance like a coat you forgot you were wearing. Every receipt becomes a document. Every conversation becomes a deposition. Every smile from a stranger becomes something to be verified. My name is Walter Greer. I spent 31 years as the Director of Fraud Risk Management at Piedmont Regional Bank, headquartered right here in Charlotte. Wire fraud, internal embezzlement, mortgage fraud, check kiting. I have seen it all, and I have seen it done by people who went to church on Sunday and coached Little League on Saturday. Fraud is not a crime committed by villains who look like villains. That is the first thing I ever told every new analyst who came to work under me. The second thing I told them was this: the numbers never lie. People lie. Documents can be falsified. But the pattern always tells the truth, if you know how to read it. I retired at 65. Ruth had been pushing me toward it for 2 years by then, and she was right, as she usually was. I had enough. The pension was solid. The house was paid off, had been paid off for 11 years. We had savings that were managed carefully. invested conservatively, never touched out of impulse. Ruth and I had lived the same way our entire married life. We didn't believe in spending money to impress people we didn't particularly like. We believed in owning what you had and knowing exactly what it was worth. Ruth passed 14 months after I retired. Pancreatic cancer. She was gone in less than 5 months from the diagnosis. I don't talk about that period very much because there are no words that fit it properly. What I will say is that Ruth Greer was the most honest person I ever knew. And I spent my entire career surrounded by people who lied for a living. The contrast was not lost on me. She kept me human in ways I am still discovering. After she was gone, the house got very quiet. Derek would call every Sunday, regular as clockwork, for about the first year. We would talk for 20 minutes, maybe 25. He would tell me about his week, ask about mine, and we would hang up feeling like we had done our duty by each other. It wasn't cold, exactly. Derek was never a cold person, but he had always been more his mother's son than mine when it came to conversation. Ruth could draw words out of that boy like pulling honey from a jar. I was better at listening than asking. Derek is 38 years old. He works in commercial real estate property management, mostly. He married Serena 4 years ago in a ceremony that cost more than I thought was wise, but that I kept that opinion to myself about. That was my first compromise, I suppose. The first of several I would make in the name of keeping the peace. Serena, I want to be fair when I talk about her, because fairness is something I owe to the story even when I don't particularly feel like being fair. When Derek first brought her around, she was charming in the way that certain people are charming, with intention, with precision, with an awareness of the effect she was having. She laughed at the right moments and asked questions about Ruth that seemed genuine. She had a way of touching Derek's arm when she spoke about him that made him look younger somehow, more at ease with himself. I noticed all of that. I also noticed other things. The handbag she carried to our first dinner together, the one she set on the chair beside her, like a guest that needed a seat. I recognized the brand. I am not a man who follows fashion, but 31 years of fraud investigation teaches you to notice price tags. Because price tags tell you something about the distance between what a person earns and what a person spends. That handbag cost somewhere between $1,500 and $2,000. Derek's salary, from what I understood of his work, was comfortable but not extravagant. Serena, as far as I knew, worked part-time doing something in event planning. I noted it and said nothing. That is the thing about a lifetime of this kind of work. You learn to hold your observations like cards close to your chest. You don't show your hand before you know what game is being played. I had no reason, at that point, to believe anything other than that my son had married a woman who perhaps spent a little more freely than was wise. That is not a crime. That is not even unusual. I had seen enough of the world to know that, so I held the card and I watched the morning. That was the shape of my life in those days. Coffee at 6:15, the porch, the birds, the garden that Ruth had started, and that I was determined to keep going, even though I had to learn from scratch which plants needed what and when. Derek's Sunday calls, growing a little shorter each month. Alistair Cole phoning every few weeks from Richmond, where he had set up his consulting practice after leaving Piedmont Regional 2 years before I did. Alistair and I had worked side by side for 19 years. He was the most methodical human being I had ever encountered in a professional setting, which is saying something, because I was not exactly known for being casual myself. Those were the pillars of my days. Simple, earned, quiet in the way that only feels right when you have spent a lifetime in noise. I told myself I was content, and for a good while, I was. The Sunday calls from Derek stopped being weekly sometime around last spring. I noticed it the way you notice a clock that has stopped not immediately, but in the silence that follows where the sound used to be. The first missed Sunday, I thought nothing of it. People have weekends that get away from them. The second one, he called on Tuesday instead and apologized in that careful way he had. The way that was more about managing my reaction than expressing genuine regret. By the third week, we had settled into something more like a bi-weekly arrangement, without either of us ever saying so out loud. I didn't push. That is not my nature. I have always believed that a man who has to demand the attention of the people who are supposed to love him has already lost something that cannot be recovered by demanding. So I waited. I tended my garden. I read the 2 books I'd been meaning to get to for the better part of a year. I took my evening walks down Pembroke Lane and back. The same route Ruth and I used to take together, which I continued partly out of habit, and partly because I was not ready to give it up. It was on one of those walks, a Thursday evening in late April, that I passed a man on the street who stopped me for just a moment. Not because I knew him, but because something about the way he carried himself was familiar in a way I could not immediately place. He was about 40. Well dressed in that particular way of someone who wanted you to notice the dressing, and he walked with the ease of a man who was accustomed to moving through spaces and being received well in them. He did not look at me. He passed without acknowledgement, his eyes on his phone, and I continued my walk. I did not think about him again that evening, but the mind sometimes knows things before the rest of you catches up. The invitation to Sunday dinner came from Serena, not from Derek. That in itself was not unusual. Serena had always been the one who managed the social calendar in their household. But something about the specific way she worded the text message, and I want to be precise here, because precision matters, something about it felt slightly off. She wrote that she had something she wanted to discuss with me. Not that Derek wanted to discuss something. Not that they both did. Serena, wanted to discuss something with me. I replied that I would be there at noon. Their house was about 20 minutes from mine, on the other side of Charlotte in a newer development called Hartwell Crossing. The houses out there were large, too large, in my opinion. For 2 people with no children, with those open floor plans that echo when you talk in them, and granite countertops that are meant to signal success to anyone who comes through the front door. I had been to that house perhaps a dozen times since they moved in 2 years ago, and every visit I was struck by the same thought: this costs more than it should. The mortgage on a house in Hartwell Crossing ran somewhere between $2,800 and $3,500 a month, depending on the specific property and the terms. I knew this not because I had investigated their finances, I had not, at that point, but because I had spent 31 years knowing what things cost and what income levels could reasonably support them. Derek's work in commercial property management paid well, but not that well. Serena's event planning income, from what little I gathered in conversation, was inconsistent at best. I parked in the driveway and sat in my car for a moment. Derek's truck was not there. I walked to the door and rang the bell, and Serena answered it within seconds, as if she had been waiting just on the other side. She was dressed with the kind of careful casualness that takes longer to put together than formal clothes do. Her hair was done. She smelled of something expensive. She smiled at me with the full warmth of a woman who wanted something. "Walter," she said, "come in. Derek had to run an errand. He'll be back in a little while." I followed her inside. The house was immaculate in that specific way that tells you someone has been cleaning, not because they enjoy cleanliness, but because they wanted the space to make an impression. There were fresh flowers on the kitchen island, the kind you buy at a florist, not a grocery store. I noticed the small things the way I always noticed small things. Quietly and without expression, we sat at the dining room table. Serena had made coffee and set out a small plate of pastries that I suspected came from that French bakery on Morrison Boulevard that charged $4 for a croissant. She poured my cup and then her own, and then she settled into her chair with the comfortable ease of someone who had rehearsed this moment. We talked about nothing for a few minutes. The weather, the garden. She asked how my knee had been. I had mentioned some stiffness the last time we spoke, and I told her it was fine. She nodded and smiled, and then she set her cup down with a small, deliberate click. She reached into the leather portfolio that had been sitting on the chair beside her. I had noticed it when I walked in, and she withdrew a small stack of papers, folded once down the middle, and she placed them on the table between us. "I wanted to talk to you about something that Derek and I have been thinking about," she said. "For a while now, we've been looking at the best ways to protect the family's assets. You know how things are these days. The market is uncertain. We just think it makes sense to consolidate things a little. Simplify the structure." She pushed the papers toward me with 2 fingers, slowly. The way you might slide a photograph across a table in a conversation you want to seem casual. I looked at the papers without touching them. It was a property transfer document. Partial conveyance. My name was on the top line as the grantor. The property listed was the house on Pembroke Lane, my house. Ruth's house. The house we had signed for together 32 years ago with a pen that Ruth had borrowed from the real estate agent and then accidentally kept in her purse and laughed about for a week afterward. I looked at the document for a long moment. Then I looked up at Serena. She was watching me with that careful smile, patient and warm and absolutely certain of itself. I did not reach for the pen she had placed beside the papers. Instead, my eyes moved without any conscious decision on my part to my jacket pocket, where I had been carrying something for the past several weeks. A habit I had developed after Ruth passed. The way people develop small habits to keep themselves tethered to the people they have lost. A Parker fountain pen. Old. The barrel worn smooth on one side where Ruth had always held it. She had used that pen to sign the original mortgage on the house in 1992. I had found it in her desk drawer the week after the funeral, and I had been carrying it ever since without quite knowing why. I thought about Ruth's handwriting on that mortgage document, the way she had pressed the pen firmly into the paper, as if she wanted the ink to go all the way through. I thought about what she would say if she were sitting beside me at this table right now. I folded my hands on the table in front of me, and I looked at Serena with the same expression I had used for 31 years when I sat across from someone who had just shown me a document they expected me to sign without reading. "Tell me more about what you and Derek have in mind," I said. My voice was steady. My hands did not move. And something shifted in Serena's eyes just slightly. Just for a moment before the smile came back. She talked for about 20 minutes. I listened the way I had always listened in situations like that one, with my full attention and my mouth closed. I did not interrupt. I did not nod encouragingly. I did not offer the small sounds of agreement that people unconsciously offer when they want a conversation to move forward. I simply listened, and I watched. And I let her fill the silence with whatever she had prepared. The argument she made was not unintelligent. I will give her that. She had done her homework, or someone had done it for her. She spoke about estate planning, about the complications of probate, about how much simpler it would be for everyone if certain assets were restructured now rather than later. She used phrases like asset protection and family security and long-term planning with the fluency of someone who had practiced them. She mentioned, almost in passing, that Derek had already spoken with a financial advisor about the best approach. A financial advisor, not a lawyer, not an estate planning attorney. A financial advisor. I noted that. She also mentioned, again almost in passing, that the transfer would be temporary in nature, more of a protective measure than a permanent change, and that everything would of course be documented properly. She said the word properly the way people say it when they are hoping you will accept it as a substitute for actually explaining what properly means. When she finished, she tilted her head slightly and looked at me with an expression that was equal parts warmth and expectation. "It just makes so much sense for the family," she said. "Derek really wants to make sure you're protected. Walter, we both do." I let a moment pass. "Where is Derek?" I asked. Something moved across her face. Gone before I could name it precisely. But I had seen that particular movement before. It was the micro-expression of a person recalibrating. "He should be back soon," she said. "His errand took a little longer than he expected." "What errand?" "Just errands. You know how Derek is." I did know how Derek was. Derek was a man who, when faced with something uncomfortable, had a lifelong habit of finding somewhere else to be. His mother had recognized that tendency in him before he was 12 years old and had spent years trying to gently address it. I had been less patient about it than Ruth, which I acknowledged was my own failing as a father. But I knew the pattern. Derek was not running an errand. Derek was not here because Derek did not want to be here for this conversation. That told me more than anything Serena had said in 20 minutes. "I appreciate you laying all of this out," I said. "I'll need to have my attorney review any documents before I consider signing anything." Serena's smile stayed in place, but it required more effort than it had a moment ago. I could see the effort. "Of course," she said. "Absolutely. We just thought, since it's all family, it would be a simpler process. Most things look simpler before an attorney reads them," I said. I picked up my coffee cup and took a sip and set it back down and looked out the window at their backyard for a moment. The yard was professionally landscaped. Flagstone patio. Outdoor furniture that probably cost more than most people's living room sets. A built-in grill that looked like it had never been used. All of it immaculate. All of it expensive. All of it somehow slightly too perfect. Like a photograph of a life rather than a life itself. I stayed for another 30 minutes out of courtesy. We talked about other things, or rather, Serena talked about other things, and I listened and responded minimally. Derek did not return while I was there. When I stood to leave, Serena walked me to the door and told me again how much they both wanted to make sure I was taken care of. She said it twice. The repetition was telling. I drove home the way you drive a route you have taken 1,000 times, hands on the wheel, eyes on the road, mind somewhere else entirely. The late afternoon light was coming through the oaks on Pembroke Lane at that low golden angle that only happens in April. The kind of light that makes everything look like a memory even while it is happening. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a few minutes after I turned the engine off. The house looked the same as it always looked. Brick front, white shutters, the azalea bushes along the porch that Ruth had planted the second spring after we moved in. She had chosen the pink ones because she said the red ones were trying too hard. I went inside and hung my jacket on the hook by the door and stood in the kitchen for a moment, without turning on any lights. Then I went to my study. The study was the one room in the house that was entirely mine. Ruth had decorated every other room with that particular confidence she had about color and arrangement, and which things belonged where. But the study she had left to me, which meant it was a room of bookshelves and filing cabinets, and a desk that was too large for the space, but that I had refused to replace because I had made every significant professional decision of my career sitting behind it. There was a reading lamp with a green glass shade that I had bought at an estate sale in 2001. There was a framed photograph of Ruth and me at Myrtle Beach taken in 1998. She was laughing at something I had just said, and I was looking at her laughing. And it was one of the best photographs of my life, because it was true. I sat down behind the desk, and I took the Parker pen out of my jacket pocket and set it in front of me. I looked at it for a while. Then I opened the bottom left drawer of the desk, the deep one, the one I used for files I wanted to keep close, and I took out a yellow legal pad, and I uncapped the pen, and I began to write. Not notes, exactly. More like an accounting. The kind you do when you are trying to determine whether what you are feeling is instinct or evidence. In 31 years of fraud investigation, I had learned to be rigorous about that distinction, because instinct without evidence is just prejudice, and evidence without instinct misses the things that numbers cannot capture alone. The truth, in my experience, usually lived in the space between the two. I wrote down everything I had observed about Serena and Derek's financial situation over the past 2 years. The house in Hartwell Crossing and its approximate cost. The car Serena drove, a current year model that ran somewhere around $55,000. The vacations I had seen photographed on the rare occasions I looked at the social media page that Derek's colleague had once shown me how to find. A trip to Cancun, a long weekend in New York, a cruise that Serena had mentioned at Thanksgiving with the casual ease of someone describing a trip to the grocery store. I wrote down what I knew about their income. Derek's salary in commercial property management I estimated somewhere between $65,000 and $80,000 annually, based on the conversations we had about his work over the years. Serena's event planning income, which she described differently every time it came up, ranging from doing really well to it's been a slow season depending on the moment. I looked at those two columns for a long time. The numbers did not add up. They did not come close to adding up. A house at Hartwell Crossing, a $55,000 car, frequent travel, designer clothing, a florist-quality flower arrangement on a Tuesday afternoon, none of that was possible on the income I was aware of. not without debt that would have been crushing, or without a source of money I did not know about. Neither of those possibilities made me feel better. I set the pen down and leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling. The old house made its small sounds around me, the settling of wood, the hum of the refrigerator down the hall, the distant sound of a neighbor's dog making an argument about something in the backyard next door. I thought about the document Serena had pushed across the table, the property transfer, my house, Ruth's house. I thought about the specificity of it, not a vague conversation about estate planning in the abstract, but an actual prepared document with my name already on it, waiting only for my signature. That level of preparation told me that this was not a new idea. This had been planned. This had been thought through. Someone had sat down and drawn up papers and decided that the house on Pembroke Lane was something they could reach for. The house that Ruth and I had paid off 11 years ago. The house that was, as far as I knew, the most significant asset in my estate. I sat with that for a while longer. Then I picked up my phone and set it back down on the desk without making a call. It was too late in the evening for the conversation I needed to have. And more importantly, I was not ready for it yet. I needed to be certain before I said anything to anyone. Certainty had been the standard I held myself to for 31 years, and I was not going to lower it now simply because the subject of my concern was my son's wife, and possibly my son himself. I made myself a simple dinner, eggs and toast. The kind of meal you make when eating is a necessity rather than an event, and I washed the dishes and dried them and put them away. Then I went back to the study, and I read for an hour without retaining much of what I read. At 9:30, I turned off the reading lamp and went to bed. I lay in the dark, and I listened to the house. 31 years of this work had taught me something that I had never found a way to explain adequately to younger analysts. Something that you could not put in a training manual or a procedural guideline. It was this: when something is wrong, you feel it before you can prove it. Not as anxiety, exactly, and not as fear. More like a change in the quality of the air around a thing. A kind of stillness where there should be movement, or movement where there should be stillness. I had felt it sitting at Serena's dining room table, watching her push that document toward me with 2 fingers. I had felt it in Derek's absence from a conversation that supposedly concerned his father's welfare. I felt it now, lying in the dark in the house that bore Ruth's choices in every room. Something was wrong. I did not yet know the shape of it, but I had spent a career learning to trust that feeling, and I was not going to stop trusting it now. I was up before the timer went off the next morning. That had been happening more often since Ruth passed the body, deciding on its own that sleep was finished, regardless of what the clock said. I lay there for a few minutes in the gray pre-dawn quiet, looking at the ceiling. And then I got up and went to the kitchen and started the coffee manually, rather than waiting for the machine to do it. It felt right, somehow, to have something to do with my hands. I carried my cup to the study instead of the porch. The legal pad was where I had left it the night before, open on the desk with my handwriting filling the top half of the first page. I sat down and read over what I had written, slowly. The way I used to read case summaries at the bank, not looking for what was there, but looking for what was missing, what had not been said, what the absence of certain information was itself telling me. The numbers were still wrong this morning. They had not corrected themselves overnight. The gap between what Derek and Serena visibly spent and what they could reasonably be expected to earn remained wide enough to drive a truck through. And the document, the property transfer document that Serena had pushed across that table with 2 fingers and a practiced smile, that document had not been prepared by a woman who was simply trying to help an aging father-in-law simplify his estate. That document had been prepared by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had decided that Walter Greer's house on Pembroke Lane was worth reaching for. I thought about that for a while. Then I picked up the pen and added 3 words to the bottom of the page. Who helped her? That was the question underneath all the other questions. Serena was intelligent, but the kind of intelligence she had was social, interpersonal. She understood people, and she understood how to move them. What she had put in front of me yesterday required a different kind of knowledge. Legal knowledge, financial knowledge, the specific knowledge of how property transfer documents are structured and what language makes them binding. That was not something you picked up from reading articles online. That was something someone had taught her, or someone had prepared for her. There was someone else in this. I had been in fraud investigation long enough to know that almost every scheme of any real complexity had an architect behind it. The person you saw first, the person doing the asking, the signing, the presenting of documents, was rarely the person who had designed the scheme. They were the face, the mechanism. The actual intelligence behind the operation was usually someone quieter, someone more careful, someone who understood that the best place to stand when a fraud begins to unravel is several steps away from the visible action. I had seen it 100 times. A teller skimming from accounts turns out to have a boyfriend who works in IT and showed her exactly which transactions would fall below the reporting threshold. A mortgage broker submitting falsified applications turns out to be running the whole operation through a shell company registered to a cousin in another state. The person in the room is never the whole story. The person in the room is just the part of the story that wanted to be seen. I sat back and looked at the photograph of Ruth on the wall. She was looking at the camera in that one, not laughing, not performing, just looking, with that particular steadiness she had that I had never been able to fully describe. Calm without being distant, present without being intrusive. She had that quality in a room that made people feel they could say the true thing instead of the easy thing. I wondered what she would make of Serena. I thought about the last Thanksgiving before Ruth got sick. Serena had been there, and Derek, and a few of Ruth's cousins from Greensboro. After dinner, when the dishes were done and the men had drifted to the living room, and Ruth and Serena were alone in the kitchen for a while. I had noticed that Ruth came back into the living room with that particular quiet about her. I had not asked about it then. I had told myself I was reading too much into nothing. I was not good at reading too much into nothing. I was good at reading exactly the right amount into exactly the right things. It was my singular professional talent. And I had chosen, in the matter of Serena, not to use it. Because she was my son's wife, and because using it felt disloyal to Derek, and because Ruth was still alive then, and I thought there was time to figure things out gradually. There was not time. There never is. I finished my coffee and poured a second cup and brought it back to the desk. Then I opened the bottom right drawer, the one with the personal files, separate from the professional ones, and I found the folder I was looking for near the back. It was a plain manila folder, unlabeled, Inside it were the documents related to the house. The original mortgage from 1992. The deed. The payoff confirmation from 2013 when we made the final payment. And a photograph that had somehow ended up in this folder rather than in an album, Ruth and I standing on the front porch the day we moved in. Both of us younger than Derek was now. Both of us grinning like we had gotten away with something. We had saved for 6 years for the down payment on that house. 6 years of careful living, of choosing the practical thing over the appealing thing, of understanding that what you built slowly was worth more than what you acquired quickly because it bore the weight of actual effort. Ruth had kept a savings ledger in those years, a small spiral notebook where she tracked every deposit, every milestone, every month that brought them closer. I had found that notebook in her desk drawer the same day I found the Parker pen. I kept them together now, in the top left drawer of my study desk, because they belonged together. I looked at the payoff confirmation for a long moment. Then I closed the folder and put it back in the drawer and picked up my phone. It was 6:53 in the morning. Alistair Cole was an early riser, always had been. Even in the years when we were both pulling long days at Piedmont Regional, he would be up. He would probably already be on his second cup of whatever that dark roast was that he had shipped in from some specialty place in Vermont that he had discovered sometime around 2018 and talked about with more enthusiasm than most people reserved for significant life events. I found his name in my contacts, and I pressed call and listened to it ring. He picked up on the third ring. "See, Walter," he said. He sounded alert, unsurprised, the way Alistair always sounded. "You're up early. I need to talk through something with you," I said, professionally. There was a brief pause. Not uncertainty, Alistair Cole did not do uncertainty. It was the pause of a man shifting gears, setting aside whatever he had been thinking about and giving his full attention to what came next. "How bad?" he said. I looked at the legal pad on my desk, at the 2 columns that didn't add up, at the 3 words I had written at the bottom of the page. "Who helped her?" "I don't know yet," I said. "That's why I'm calling." And then I told him everything. From the beginning. From the first dinner when I noticed the handbag, to the Sunday calls that had grown shorter and then less frequent, to the house in Hartwell Crossing that cost more than it should, to yesterday afternoon and the dining room table and the document with my name on the top line and the pen that Serena had placed beside it like an afterthought. Alistair listened without interrupting. That was one of the things I had always valued most about him. He understood that listening was not a passive act. It was a discipline. When I finished, the line was quiet for a moment. "Send me whatever you have," he said. "Anything documented. I'll start pulling some public records this morning. Property filings, business registrations, anything connected to their address. I haven't confirmed anything yet," I said. "I want to be sure before this goes anywhere." "That's why you called me," he said. "We'll be sure." I thanked him and we said our goodbyes, and I set the phone down on the desk. Outside, the morning had arrived fully while we were talking. The light was coming through the study window at the angle that meant the oaks were casting their long, early shadows across the yard. A cardinal had landed on the bird feeder that Ruth had put up 12 years ago, and that I had repainted twice since then to keep it from going gray. I watched the cardinal for a moment. Then I uncapped the Parker pen, and I turned to a fresh page on the legal pad, and I wrote the date at the top. neat and precise. The way I had always begun every case file in 31 years of work. I did not know yet what I was going to find, but I knew how to find it. And I knew that when I did, I was not going to look away from it simply because it was going to hurt. That was not the kind of man I had ever been. It was not the kind of man Ruth had loved. And it was not the kind of man I intended to become now. At 68 years old, sitting in the quiet of a house full of her memory, with her pen in my hand and her trust in my chest, like something I was still carrying home. Alistair Cole was the kind of man who did not waste motion. In 19 years of working beside him at Piedmont Regional, I had never once seen him shuffle papers without purpose, make a phone call without knowing exactly what he intended to say before he dialed, or arrive at a conclusion before the evidence supported it. He was precise in the way that certain instruments are precise not because precision was a personality trait he had cultivated, but because imprecision was simply not something his mind was built to tolerate. I had always respected that about him enormously. In a field where people routinely dressed up guesswork in the language of certainty, Alistair was the rarest kind of colleague, a man who knew the difference. He called me back the following morning, a Tuesday, at 7:45. I was on the porch with my second cup of coffee, watching a pair of mockingbirds conduct what appeared to be a territorial dispute in the oak tree nearest the fence, when my phone buzzed on the small table beside the rocking chair. I looked at the screen. Alistair. I picked up before the second ring. "I've been pulling records since yesterday afternoon," he said, without any preliminary. That was Alistair. No preamble. No small talk when there was work to discuss. "Walter, you need to hear what I found." I set my coffee cup down. "Go ahead," I said. What he told me over the next 15 minutes was methodical, precise, and deeply troubling. He had started, as he always started, with the public record. Property filings, tax records, business registrations in Mecklenburg County and the surrounding area. The house at Hartwell Crossing, the one Derek and Serena had moved into 2 years ago, was registered under a financing arrangement that Alistair had flagged immediately. The mortgage was not a conventional loan. It was structured through a program he had identified as connected to the Veterans Affairs Housing Assistance Framework. Specifically, a subset of VA-backed financing that carried significant federal subsidy and was intended exclusively for qualifying veterans and their immediate families. Derek was not a veteran. I knew that with certainty. He had gone directly from high school to a 2-year business program at a community college, and then into commercial real estate work. He had never served. Neither had Serena, as far as I knew. "Who is the qualifying veteran on the application?" I asked. "That," Alistair said, "is where it gets interesting." He told me the name. I did not recognize it immediately, but Alistair had already done more digging. The name belonged to a man in his late 50s who had served 2 tours and been honorably discharged 15 years ago. He currently lived in Gastonia, about 40 minutes west of Charlotte. His name appeared on a business registration in Mecklenburg County, a small property consulting firm registered 3 years ago. The registered agent for that firm was listed as someone named Marcus Telle. I was quiet for a moment. "Marcus Tell," I said. "You know the name?" Alistair asked. "I don't," I said, "but I intend to." What Alistair had found in that first pass of public records was not yet proof of a federal crime. It was the outline of the shape of something that had been constructed carefully, with awareness of how these programs worked and where their oversight gaps were. VA housing assistance fraud was not common in the obvious sense, but it was not unheard of either. I had seen cases peripherally during my years at the bank schemes where unscrupulous brokers and so-called financial advisors had exploited the program's trust-based structure to funnel benefits to people who did not qualify, collecting fees and commissions at every step. The veteran whose name was on the application was almost certainly not a willing architect of the scheme. More likely, he was a recruited participant, someone who had been approached, perhaps offered a payment or a share of something, and had allowed his eligibility to be used as the qualifying mechanism for a transaction he did not fully understand or had been deliberately misled about. That was a crime, a federal one. And if Serena and Derek's house had been financed this way, it meant they had been living for 2 years in a property secured through fraud against a United States government program. I sat with that for a long moment after I ended the call with Alistair. The morning had gone fully bright by then, the mockingbirds apparently having reached some agreement and gone their separate ways. The neighborhood was doing what it always did at this hour, a car backing out of a driveway 3 houses down, a woman walking a small dog along the sidewalk, the distant sound of a lawn service starting up somewhere on the next block. Ordinary Tuesday morning. Ordinary life proceeding without any awareness of what I was sitting in the middle of. I went inside and poured the last of the coffee and stood at the kitchen counter and thought about Derek. I thought about him at 9 years old, sitting at this same kitchen table doing his arithmetic homework, with the particular concentration he brought to things he found difficult. His tongue pressed slightly against his upper lip the way it always was when he was working hard at something. I thought about him at 17, walking across the stage at his high school graduation in a gown that was slightly too long for him, looking out at the audience with an expression that was trying very hard to be cool and not quite succeeding. I thought about him at 34, sitting in this kitchen the week after his mother was diagnosed, holding a cup of coffee with both hands and looking at the table, unable to find any words that were adequate to the moment. I had never stopped loving that boy, not for a single day of his life, and that was exactly why what I was about to do was going to be the hardest thing I had done since I buried his mother. Because loving someone does not mean protecting them from the consequences of what they choose. Ruth had understood that better than I did. She had tried to teach it to me in her patient way. Over the course of 39 years together, you don't help a person by carrying what they need to carry themselves. You help them by being honest with them, even when honesty costs you something. This was going to cost me something. I was not sure yet exactly what, but I knew the price was coming, and I knew I was going to pay it. I set my coffee cup in the sink and went to my study and sat down behind the desk and opened the legal pad to the page where I had written those 3 words 2 mornings ago. Who helped her? I wrote a new name below them, Marcus Telle. And then I picked up my phone and called Alistair back and told him I needed everything he could find on that name. Everything. Business records, professional licenses, any legal history, any prior complaints with financial regulatory bodies, any connection to VA programs or veteran-related services. Already started, Alistair said. Of course he had. Marcus Telle had been careful. That was the first thing Alistair said when he called back 2 days later. And in my experience, when a man in Alistair Cole's position described someone as careful, it was not a compliment. It was a warning. Careful people in the context of financial fraud were not careful because they were honest. They were careful because they understood exactly which lines not to cross visibly, which records to keep clean, and which transactions to route through enough intermediary steps that the connection between cause and consequence became difficult to establish without significant investigative effort. Alistair had found him anyway. That was what 19 years of working together had taught me about Alistair Cole. Careful people left traces. And Alistair had the patience and the methodology to follow traces to their source, regardless of how faint they were. Marcus Tell was 42 years old. He operated a business called Tell Advisory Group, registered in Mecklenburg County 3 years ago, with a stated purpose of financial consulting and real estate advisory services. He did not hold a license as a registered investment advisor. He did not hold a license as a mortgage broker. What he held was a real estate salesperson license that had been issued 6 years ago and had a notation in the state licensing database indicating a complaint had been filed against him 4 years back. A complaint that had been investigated and closed without disciplinary action, which in my experience meant either that the complaint lacked sufficient documentation or that the person who filed it had been persuaded not to pursue it further. The complaint, Alistair had managed to determine through a contact at the State Real Estate Commission, had involved allegations of misrepresentation in a real estate transaction. The specifics were not part of the public record, but the fact of it was there, quiet and small, like a hairline crack in a foundation wall. Tell Advisory Group had no significant web presence, no professional website, no listings in business directories. It existed in the public record the way certain entities are designed to exist, just enough to be legitimate if someone looked, not enough to invite scrutiny. The registered office address was a suite number in a shared office building on South Tryon Street, the kind of address that a dozen different businesses might share through a mail forwarding service. But here was what Alistair had found that mattered most. Marcus Telle's name appeared as a co-signatory on 3 separate real estate transactions in Mecklenburg County over the past 4 years. In each transaction, the primary financing had been structured through VA-related programs. In each transaction, the qualifying veteran listed was a different individual, none of whom, based on public tax and property records, appeared to actually reside in the properties in question. And in each transaction, the eventual occupants were individuals with no documented military service. 3 transactions, 3 different veterans, 3 properties where the qualifying veteran was, in effect, a name on a piece of paper rather than a person with a genuine connection to the financing. Derek and Serena's house at Hartwell Crossing appeared to be the 4th. I read through the notes Alistair had emailed me, printed them on the printer in my study, and laid them out on the desk in the order in which the transactions had occurred. Then I sat back and looked at the pattern. It was elegant, in the way that certain fraudulent schemes are elegant, meaning it had been designed by someone who understood the system well enough to find its pressure points. VA housing assistance programs operated on a framework of trust and self-certification that had been built to serve veterans efficiently, not to anticipate sophisticated exploitation. The oversight mechanisms existed, but were not designed for this specific pattern of abuse, which meant that without someone actively looking for it, the scheme could run for years before attracting attention. Marcus Tella had been running it for at least 4 years. The question that sat at the center of everything now was the question of how Serena connected to Marcus Teld. Because that connection, its nature, its history, its depth was the thread that, if pulled correctly, would unravel everything else. I called Alistair. I need to know how she knows him, I said. Working on it, he said. There's a social media presence. Serena's. I've had someone go through it going back 5 years. There are photographs. What kind of photographs? The kind that suggest they knew each other before she met Derek. Alistair said. Events. Gatherings. A few occasions where they appear in the same frame. Nothing overt, but consistent enough over time to establish a prior relationship. I was quiet for a moment. How far back, I asked. At least 3 years before she married Derek. Alistair said, possibly longer. I let that settle. 3 years before she married Derek. Which meant that when Serena had come into Derek's life, she had already known Marcus Tellem. She had already, in all likelihood, been part of whatever he was building. The question of whether she had pursued Derek with intention, whether my son had been a target from the beginning, rather than a husband who had gradually been drawn into something, was a question I was not yet ready to answer definitively. But the timeline made it impossible to dismiss. I thought about the wedding. 4 years ago, a ceremony that had cost more than I thought was wise. I had written a check as a contribution toward the costs, a significant check. The kind you write when your son is getting married, and you want to be generous even when you have reservations. At the time, I had attributed the expense to Serena's taste and Derek's desire to give her what she wanted. I had not considered the possibility that the expense itself might have been part of a larger financial picture I was not being allowed to see. I pulled the legal pad toward me, and I wrote a new line beneath Marcus Telly's name. Prior relationship minimum 3 years before marriage. Then I sat and looked at what I had written. I had worked fraud cases that involved strangers taking advantage of strangers, and those cases were difficult enough. I had worked cases that involved colleagues taking advantage of colleagues, and those were harder because of the betrayal embedded in the proximity. But I had never personally been at the center of a case. I had never been the one sitting at the desk with the legal pad, knowing that the person whose name I was writing down had been sitting across from me at holiday dinners, asking about my knee, smiling with practiced warmth over coffee cups in an immaculate house that had been purchased with stolen federal benefits. There is a difference between investigating fraud as a profession and investigating it as a man whose family is at the center of it. I want to be honest about that difference, because I think it matters. The professional part of me, the part that had spent 31 years building cases methodically and without emotional interference, that part was functioning exactly as it was supposed to. It was calm. It was focused. It was following the evidence where the evidence led, but underneath that, in the place where the profession did not reach, something else was happening. Something quieter and heavier. The understanding that my son had known about this. Not perhaps the full architecture of it, not necessarily every transaction, every veteran's name, every fraudulent filing, but the house, the financing, the source of the money that was making their life possible. Derek was not an unintelligent man. He worked in commercial real estate. He understood financing structures. He knew, at some level, that what was supporting his life did not add up, and he had said nothing. That silence was its own kind of answer. I had not spoken to Derek since the Sunday he was supposed to be at that dinner, and wasn't. That was 11 days. Long enough for the silence to become its own kind of statement. Derek was not a man who could sustain deliberate avoidance without it showing he had never been good at sustained deception, which was one of the reasons his involvement in this thing troubled me as much as it did. A man who was genuinely comfortable with dishonesty does not avoid the person he is being dishonest toward. He performs normalcy. He calls on schedule. He shows up for dinner and asks about your knee and laughs at the right moments. The fact that Derek had gone quiet told me that whatever role he was playing in this, he was not playing it easily. That was something. Not enough, but something. I decided to go to him, not to confront. Not yet. I did not have enough assembled to make a confrontation productive, and a confrontation without sufficient preparation would only give them time to move things, delete records, coordinate a story. I had seen that happen too many times in professional cases, an investigator moving too quickly, tipping his hand before the evidence was complete, watching the whole structure scatter like birds off a wire. I was not going to make that mistake. I called Derek on a Wednesday morning and told him I wanted to take him to lunch. Just the two of us. I kept my voice exactly as it always was, unhurried, mild, the voice of a father suggesting an ordinary thing. Derek hesitated for a moment that lasted slightly longer than a natural hesitation. And then he said yes. We agreed on a barbecue place we had been going to together since he was in his 20s, a small family-owned spot on Central Avenue that had not changed its menu or its decor in 20 years, and that served pulled pork that Ruth had once described as a religious experience. I got there first and took the booth in the back corner, the one with a clear sight line to the door. Old habit. Derek came in about 4 minutes after noon. He looked tired in a way that a night's poor sleep does not explain the kind of tired that comes from carrying something for an extended period. He had lost a little weight since I had last seen him, which on Derek's frame was noticeable. He smiled when he saw me, and the smile was genuine in the way that his smiles had always been genuine, which made it harder rather than easier to sit across from him. We talked about surface things while we waited for the food, the weather, a road construction project that had been making his commute difficult, a baseball game he had watched the previous weekend. I let him set the pace. I asked questions that required real answers, but not difficult ones. I was watching him the way I had always watched people in the early stages of a conversation. I needed to go somewhere specific, not for what they said, but for the quality of their attention, the places where their eyes went, the small adjustments they made when certain subjects came near, when the food arrived. Derek looked at his plate for a moment, and then looked up at me. "Dad," he said. "About the other Sunday." "You don't have to explain," I said. "I wasn't there," he said. "I know you weren't." He was quiet for a moment. He picked up his fork and set it back down. "Serena mentioned that she talked to you. About some paperwork." "She did," I said. "I should have been there for that conversation." He said, "That was wrong." "I know that." I looked at him steadily. "Why weren't you?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the table, at the space between his plate and mine, the way he used to look at his arithmetic homework when he was 9 years old, and the answer was somewhere he couldn't quite reach. "It's complicated," he said finally. That word, complicated. I had heard it across a desk from dozens of people over 31 years. It was what people said when the true answer was something they were not prepared to say out loud. It was not a lie, exactly. Things were complicated. But complicated was also a door you could stand behind indefinitely without ever opening it. Derek, I said, I'm your father, not your adversary, but I need you to talk to me. He looked up. Something moved across his face, the same kind of movement I had seen on Serena's face at the dining room table. That micro shift of a person deciding how much to reveal. But on Derek, it looked different. On Derek, it looked like pain. There are things about our situation that I'm not, he started, and then stopped. The house. The way things are set up. I didn't design all of it. I want you to know that. What did you design? I asked. He shook his head. Not a denial. More like a man trying to find the edge of something in the dark. I made choices, he said. I went along with things I probably should have pushed back on. I told myself it was fine because nobody was getting hurt. He paused. That's what I told myself. I let the silence sit between us for a moment. Is that still what you believe? I said. That nobody is getting hurt. He didn't answer. But the way he looked at me in that moment, with a directness that he had been avoiding for the better part of a year, with something in his eyes that was very close to the expression he had worn the week his mother was diagnosed. That look told me that whatever story he had been telling himself, he was no longer entirely able to believe it. I did not press further. I had what I needed from this conversation, which was not a confession and not a confrontation, but a confirmation. Derek knew. He had known for some time. He had chosen the easier path because the easier path was there and because Serena was his wife, and because human beings have an extraordinary capacity for convincing themselves that the thing they want to be true is the thing that is true. We finished lunch mostly in silence, the comfortable kind that had always existed between us even when words were difficult. When we stood to leave, Derek put his hand briefly on my shoulder the way he had done since he was old enough to reach it. A gesture that had started as something boyish and affectionate, and had become over the years a kind of shorthand for things neither of us said easily. I drove home and went directly to my study. I sat down behind the desk, and I picked up the Parker pen, and I opened the legal pad, and I wrote. In the precise and deliberate handwriting I had used for 3 decades of case notes. A summary of everything Derek had said. Not just the words, but the spaces between the words. Not just the answers, but the questions he had not been able to answer. I noted the moment when something moved across his face. I noted the phrase, I didn't design all of it. I noted the particular quality of his silence when I asked whether he still believed nobody was getting hurt. Then I sat back, and I looked at what I had written. Derek was not the architect. That much I believed. He was what I had suspected from the beginning, a man who had been drawn into something gradually, step by step, each step small enough to seem manageable, until the distance between where he had started and where he now stood was too great to easily cross back. That was one of the oldest patterns in fraud, not the dramatic recruitment, not the explicit conspiracy, but the slow normalization of things that should never have been normal. You do not ask a person to cross a line all at once. You move the line incrementally until they look up one day and realize they cannot remember where it used to be. I did not excuse him for it. Excuse was not something I had the right to offer, and it would not have helped him even if I did. But I understood it. And understanding it was different from condoning it. And both of those things were different from what I was going to have to do next. I reached into the bottom right drawer and pulled out a card I had not used in 2 years. The name on it was Thomas Beaumont, and he was the best estate planning attorney in Charlotte. I knew this not because I had needed an estate planning attorney recently, but because I had spent a career working alongside legal professionals, and I had made it my business to know who was good at what in this city. I called his office and made an appointment for the following Monday. Then I called Alistair. I talked to Derek, I said. And Alistair said, "He knows," I said. "Not everything, but enough." Alistair was quiet for a moment. "How are you holding up?" "Walter." It was the first time he had asked me that. Alistair was not a man given to that kind of question, which meant he had been waiting for the right moment to ask it, and had decided this was it. "I'm all right," I said. "I know what needs to happen." "Yes," Alistair said. "So do I." Thomas Beaumont's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Tryon Street, with a view of uptown Charlotte that on a clear day stretched all the way to the horizon. I had been in that office once before, years ago, when Ruth and I had updated our wills after her mother passed, and we had decided it was time to get everything in proper order. Beaumont had been recommended by a colleague at the bank, and within the first 15 minutes of that initial meeting, I had understood why. He was methodical, clear, and entirely without the tendency toward unnecessary complexity that afflicts certain members of the legal profession who confuse elaborateness with expertise. He said what he meant. He meant what he said. Ruth had liked him immediately, which in my experience was a reliable indicator of character. He remembered me when I walked in. We shook hands and sat down, and I told him what I needed. I told him I wanted to establish an irrevocable trust. I explained, without going into every detail of the circumstances, that I had reason to believe my assets might be subject to external pressure in the near future, and that I wanted to ensure the house on Pembroke Lane and my investment accounts were legally protected before that pressure materialized. I told him I had a specific timeline in mind. I wanted the trust documents drafted and executed within 2 weeks if possible. Beaumont listened with the focused attention of a man who has heard many things in his office and learned not to be surprised by any of them. When I finished, he asked several precise questions about the nature and value of the assets, the intended beneficiaries, and my understanding of what irrevocable meant in practical terms, meaning that once the trust was established and the assets transferred into it, I could not unilaterally reverse that transfer. The assets would belong to the trust, managed according to its terms, and no external party could make a claim against them as if they were my personal property. That was exactly what I wanted. An irrevocable trust was not a complicated instrument, but it was a permanent one. And Beaumont was appropriately careful about making sure I understood the permanence before we proceeded. I told him I had spent 31 years in financial risk management and that I understood the instrument thoroughly. He nodded once and said he would have a draft ready by the end of the following week. I thanked him, and we shook hands again, and I took the elevator down to the lobby and walked out onto Tryon Street into a bright Monday morning. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, The city moved around me the way cities do, purposeful, indifferent, full of people going toward things and away from things without any awareness of what the man standing still on the corner was carrying. I have always found something clarifying about that quality of cities. The indifference of the crowd is not cruelty. It is simply scale. It reminds you that your particular trouble, however large it feels from inside it, is one thread among millions, and that the world does not pause for any of them. I walked to where I had parked and I drove home. That evening, Alistair called with more on Marcus Tell. What he had found in the week since our last conversation was the result of careful work through channels I was not going to ask him to specify precisely. Because Alistair had connections built over decades in compliance and financial regulation that operated in the space between official inquiry and private investigation. And I trusted him to use those connections responsibly without needing to audit every step. What mattered was what he had found. Marcus Tell had a history with Serena that went back further than 3 years before the marriage. Alistair had located a connection that placed them together at a real estate networking event in Charlotte approximately 7 years ago, 2 years before Serena had met Derek. Photographs from the event, posted publicly by the organizing association, showed them in the same frame on 2 separate occasions during the evening. They were not photographed together in the deliberate way of people who want to document their relationship. They were photographed the way people are photographed at events when the camera sweeps across a room incidentally, adjacently, but incidentally and adjacently, twice in one evening, at an event that neither of them had any obvious professional reason to attend at that stage in their respective careers. Alistair had also found something more significant. 3 years ago, 1 year before Serena married Derek, a woman matching Serena's description had been listed as an emergency contact on a rental application in Union County, south of Charlotte. The primary applicant on that rental application was Marcus Tell. The emergency contact listed a first name that was a diminutive of Serena's given name, with a phone number that Alistair had traced through publicly available records to a number previously associated with Serena's name in a separate filing. Emergency contact. The person you list when you need someone to call if something goes wrong. You do not list a casual professional acquaintance as your emergency contact. You list someone whose number you know without looking it up. Someone who will answer. Someone who knows you well enough to be useful in a moment of crisis. I sat with that for a long time. The picture that was forming was not the one I had initially assumed. I had thought of Serena as someone who had met Marcus, been recruited into his scheme, and then found Derek as a useful mechanism, a man with a father who owned property, a man whose name could be attached to a financing structure, a man who was sufficiently passive to be managed. That picture cast Serena as a relatively recent participant in Marcus Tell's operations, but the timeline Alistair had assembled suggested something older and more deliberate. 7 years of documented connection. An emergency contact relationship that predated the marriage by at least a year. The possibility, and I was careful to hold it as a possibility rather than a certainty, because certainty required more than I yet had the possibility that Serena and Marcus Tell had not simply worked together on a scheme, but had planned together. Designed together, that Derek had not been an incidental choice, but a considered one. That the house on Pembroke Lane, my house, had been identified as an asset worth reaching for before my son had ever brought Serena home to meet his mother. That thought required me to sit very still for a moment, I had built my career on not letting emotion interfere with analysis. I had managed it successfully for 31 years, across hundreds of cases involving real people and real harm and real betrayal. I knew the discipline. I had practiced it so long, it had become something close to instinct. But this was not a case file on my desk. This was my son's marriage. This was the house where Ruth's reading glasses were still in the drawer of her bedside table because I had not been able to move them. This was the life we had built, the two of us, with 6 years of careful saving and 32 years of careful living. And someone had looked at it from the outside and decided it was something they could take. I allowed myself 60 seconds of that feeling. I have learned, over many years, that you cannot suppress emotion entirely. It finds its way out in other forms if you try, usually less constructive ones, but you can contain it. You can give it a defined space and then step back out of that space and return to the work. I gave it 60 seconds. Then I picked up the pen. I wrote Marcus Telle's name at the top of a fresh page. Beneath it, I wrote everything Alistair had told me, in chronological order, with dates and sources noted. Then I drew a line connecting Marcus Telle's name to Serena's, and beneath Serena's name I drew another line, and at the end of that line I wrote Derek's name, and I sat and looked at the structure of it for a long time. Derek was at the end of a chain he had not built, and may not have fully understood. That did not make him innocent, but it shaped his culpability in a way that mattered, both legally and personally. A man who is deceived into participating in a fraud is in a different position than a man who designs one. The law recognized that distinction, and more importantly, I recognized it as a father. I called Alistair one more time that evening. "We need to talk about next steps," I said. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "I have a contact at the FBI field office here. Financial crimes. She's good. Walter. She's the right person for this." "Not yet," I said. "I want the trust executed first. I want everything locked down before we hand anything to anyone." "How long?" 2 weeks," I said. "Beaumont said 2 weeks for the trust documents." "All right," Alistair said. 2 weeks. "And Alistair," I said. "Yes. Thank you," I said, "for all of this." He was quiet for a moment. "You'd have done the same," he said. "You have done the same. More than once." That was true. We had done this kind of work together for 19 years, and the loyalty between us had been built in the way that real loyalty is always built, not through declarations, but through accumulated evidence, through showing up, through doing the work when it was hard, and saying the true thing when it was uncomfortable, and trusting each other with the things that mattered. I was grateful for him in a way that did not require words to be complete. I said goodnight and ended the call and sat in the quiet study for a while longer. On the desk in front of me, the legal pad held everything I had learned in the past 2 weeks, laid out in my handwriting, page after page, careful and precise and damning. On the corner of the desk, the Parker pen rested where I had set it down. In the top left drawer, Ruth's savings ledger sat next to the pen's leather case. I thought about her for a moment, about the way she had pressed that pen into the mortgage paper 32 years ago, as if she wanted the ink to go all the way through, as if she was making something permanent. as if she already knew, in the way that Ruth always seemed to know things, that what they were building that day was worth making permanent. It was still worth it, and in 2 weeks, it was going to be protected in a way that no document pushed across a dining room table with 2 fingers and a practiced smile could ever touch. I turned off the lamp, I went to bed, and for the first time in 2 weeks, I slept without waking before the timer went off. The trust documents arrived on a Thursday. Beaumont's assistant emailed them at just past 9 in the morning. A clean PDF with a cover note explaining which pages required signatures and which required initials and where the notary would need to witness. I printed the entire packet, 41 pages, and carried it to the desk and read every word of it before I picked up the Parker pen. That is something I want to say clearly. Because I think it matters, I read every word. Not because I distrusted Beaumont, I trusted him completely, but because a man who signs documents he has not fully read is a man who has not learned the most basic lesson that 40 years of adult life ought to teach. Ruth used to say that the signature line is not the end of a document. It is the beginning of an obligation. She was right about that. As she was right about most things, the trust was structured exactly as I had requested. The house on Pembroke Lane was transferred into it, along with the 2 investment accounts I maintained at separate institutions, a conservative equity portfolio that had been growing quietly for 22 years, and a fixed income account that Ruth and I had started specifically as a long-term reserve. The beneficiary named in the trust was Derek. That had not been a difficult decision, despite everything. He was my son. Whatever he had done or failed to do, whatever choices lay ahead of him, he remained the person I intended to leave things to when I was gone. The trust simply ensured that what I left him would come to him on terms I controlled, in a structure that no external party, no creditor, no legal action, no opportunistic claim could reach into and take. Once those assets were inside an irrevocable trust, they were beyond the reach of anyone who might try to argue a claim against them. They were beyond the reach of Serena. They were beyond the reach of Marcus Tella. They were beyond the reach of any legal maneuver that either of them, or anyone acting on their behalf, might attempt in the months ahead. I signed where I was supposed to sign and initialed where I was supposed to initial, and then I drove to Beaumont's office and sat with a notary for 20 minutes and made it all official. When I walked out of that building for the second time in 2 weeks, I felt something I had not felt in a while. Not relief, exactly. Something quieter than relief. The particular steadiness that comes when you have done the one thing that needed doing and done it correctly. The house was safe. Ruth's house. The house we had saved for and paid off and lived in for 32 years. Whatever happened next, no one was going to take that. I drove home and called Alistair. "It's done," I said. "The trust is executed." "Good," he said. And then, after a brief pause, "I've been working on the package for Agent Reyes." Agent Reyes was the name of Alistair's contact at the FBI field office in Charlotte. Her full name was Sandra Reyes, and she worked in the Financial Crimes Unit, which handled precisely the kind of case we were assembling: wire fraud, false statements to a federal program, conspiracy. Alistair had spoken with her once, informally, without names, to gauge the interest level and confirm that what we had was worth bringing forward. She had indicated, through Alistair, that the pattern of VA housing fraud he had described was something her unit was actively interested in, and that a well-documented case with clear transaction records and established connections between parties would be received seriously. Well-documented was the operative phrase. I had spent 31 years building well-documented cases. I understood what that meant in practice. It meant not just having the evidence, but organizing it in a way that a federal investigator could follow, without ambiguity, a clear chronology. A clear chain of connection between individuals and transactions. Supporting documentation for every assertion, and a presentation that did not require the recipient to do significant interpretive work to understand what they were looking at. Federal investigators were competent people, but they were also busy people with caseloads that demanded efficiency. You did not hand someone a box of documents and call it a case. You handed them a case. That was what Alistair and I had been building over the past 2 weeks. While Beaumont had been preparing the trust documents, Alistair had been systematically organizing everything we had gathered into a structured package. The 4 properties, the 3 prior transactions, and Derek and Serena's house documented with their VA financing structures, the names of the qualifying veterans, and the evidence that none of those veterans were actual occupants of the properties, the business registration for Tele Advisory Group and its lack of proper licensing, the prior complaint with the State Real Estate Commission, the photographic evidence of the prior relationship between Serena and Marcus Telle, with a timeline establishing that the relationship predated Derek's marriage by at least 3 years and possibly as many as 7. The emergency contact record in Union County, and my own notes, the legal pad pages, typed up and organized by date documenting the conversation with Serena at the dining room table, the lunch with Derek, and every observation I had made in the weeks between. It was a thorough package. The kind that, in my professional experience, gave an investigating agency a strong foundation to build on. We were not handing them a conviction that was not our job. We were handing them a map and telling them that what was at the end of it was worth the journey. Alistair said the package would be ready to transmit within the week. I thanked him and ended the call and sat at my desk for a moment in the quiet of the study. Outside, the afternoon was doing what Charlotte afternoons do in late spring, warm and slightly hazy. The light soft through the oak leaves. The neighborhood settled into that particular midday stillness that falls between the morning rush and the evening return. A day that looked, from the outside, like any other day on Pembroke Lane. I opened the top left drawer of the desk. Ruth's savings ledger was there. The small spiral notebook with her handwriting on every page, amounts and dates, and the occasional small note in the margin. The kind of notes she made when something struck her as worth remembering. I had not opened it since the week after the funeral. I was not sure I was ready to open it now, but I took it out and held it in my hands for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the slight warping of the cover from years of being carried and set down and picked up again. I set it back in the drawer without opening it. Some things you hold without reading. Some things are enough just to know they are there. I had work left to do, but the hardest structural piece was in place. The house was protected. The case was nearly assembled. What remained was the part I had been thinking about least and dreading most, the moment when everything we had built would leave my desk and enter the world and begin its own trajectory. One that I would no longer be able to direct or contain. That moment was coming, I was as ready for it as I was going to be. Serena came to the house on a Tuesday evening without calling first. I heard the car in the driveway from the study, a sound I recognized because the engine of her car had a particular quality to it. That smooth, expensive quietness of a vehicle that costs more than it should. I sat still for a moment and listened to the car door close and then the footsteps on the front walk, and then the doorbell. I took my time getting to the door. She was standing on the porch in the early evening light, wearing a linen blazer over a silk blouse. Her hair done the way it was always done. Her expression arranged into something that was meant to read as casual and friendly and entirely unannounced in the most natural way possible. She had a bottle of wine in one hand, a good one, from the look of the label, and she smiled when I opened the door with the full warmth of a woman who had decided that warmth was the correct opening move. "Walter," she said, "I hope I'm not interrupting anything. I was in the neighborhood and I just thought I'd stop by." Nobody is ever just in the neighborhood on Pembroke Lane. It is a residential street in a quiet part of Charlotte that does not lie between any two places that anyone has reason to travel between unless that street is their destination. I had lived here for 32 years. I knew every neighbor and every car that came down this block, and people did not pass through accidentally. "Come in," I said. I led her to the living room rather than the study. The study was where my work lived, where the legal pad was, where the printed documents were organized in their folders in the bottom drawer. The living room was neutral territory, Ruth's furniture, Ruth's photographs on the walls, the reading chair by the window where I spent my evenings. I sat in that chair, and Serena sat on the sofa across from me and set the wine bottle on the coffee table between us, as if it were a gift rather than a prop. She began with small talk. She asked about the garden. She mentioned that Derek had been working long hours lately and that she had been trying to get him to slow down. She made a comment about the neighborhood, how quiet and lovely it was, how she always felt at ease here. Every sentence was a carefully placed stone, building a path toward whatever she had actually come to say. I waited. It took about 8 minutes. "Walter," she said, setting her hands in her lap with the deliberateness of a woman beginning the part of the conversation she had rehearsed. "I wanted to come by because I feel like things have been a little tense between us. Since my visit a few weeks ago. I don't want that. I really don't. We're family." "We are," I said. "I think I may have approached things the wrong way," she said. "The paperwork, the way I presented it. I can see how it might have seemed abrupt. That wasn't my intention." "What was your intention?" I asked. She looked at me with an expression that was working hard to be open and sincere. "To protect the family," she said. "That's all it's ever been. Derek worries about you. Living alone. The house being in your name only. Without any kind of protective structure around it. We just wanted to help." I looked at her for a long moment. In 31 years of sitting across from people who were not telling the truth, I had developed a particular way of looking at them during those moments, not aggressive, not accusatory, simply attentive. The way you look at something you are trying to see clearly. It was a look that made some people uncomfortable enough to keep talking when they should have stopped, filling the silence with more words than they had intended to offer. Serena was not unaware of it. I saw her register it, saw the slight adjustment in her posture, the almost imperceptible recalibration. "Serena," I said, How long have you known Marcus Telle? The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds. In a normal conversation, 3 seconds is not a long time. In the kind of conversation we were having, 3 seconds is long enough to watch a person's entire architecture of preparation come under sudden and unexpected pressure. Her expression did not collapse. I will give her credit for that. She was composed in a way that spoke to significant practice at managing moments of exposure. But something shifted behind her eyes, a flash of something that was not quite fear and not quite anger, but contained elements of both before the composure reasserted itself. Marcus, she said. He's a professional contact. Through the real estate work. How long? I said again. I don't know exactly, she said. A few years? Why? I did not answer the question. I let it sit in the room between us. Walter, she said, and her voice had changed slightly. The warmth was still there, but it was working harder now, requiring more effort to maintain its temperature. I'm not sure what you think is going on, but I want you to know that everything Derek and I have done has been with your best interests in mind. You're important to us. This family is important to us. I know you believe that, I said. Something about the way I said it, the quietness of it, the absence of any edge seemed to unsettle her more than a direct accusation would have. She looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not the practiced warmth, not the careful smile. Something beneath all of that. Something that was trying to determine exactly how much I knew and whether there was still a move available to her. Is there something specific you'd like to talk about? She said. Not tonight, I said. She stayed for another 20 minutes. She tried several more approaches, returning to the family language, mentioning Derek twice more, making a comment about how much she missed Ruth's presence at family gatherings that was designed to humanize herself, and that landed with a particular hollowness given the circumstances. I responded to everything with the same mild attentiveness, giving her nothing to work with and nothing to push against. When she stood to leave, she picked up the wine bottle from the coffee table, and I thought for a moment she was going to take it with her. Instead, she set it back down. For you, she said. I hope we can clear the air soon. Walter. I really do. I walked her to the door after I heard her car pull out of the driveway. I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I went to the study, and I sat down, and I wrote a detailed account of the visit on the legal pad, the time she arrived, the time she left, the specific things she had said, and the order in which she had said them, and her response to the name Marcus Tell with the 3-second silence noted precisely. Then I called Alistair. She came to the house, I said. He was quiet for a moment. In person. Unannounced, I said. Tuesday evening. She brought wine. What did she want? To take the temperature, I said. To find out how much I know. She mentioned Marcus Telle's name without any visible recognition until I pushed on it. And then she called him a professional contact. She's worried, Alistair said. Yes, I said. She is. How close is Beaumont to having the trust finalized? It's already done, I said. Executed last Thursday. Another brief silence. Then she's too late, Alistair said. Yes, I said. She is. I looked at the wine bottle sitting on the coffee table in the living room, visible through the open study door. It was a good bottle. probably $60 or $70. A calculated gesture from a woman who had calculated everything and was beginning to discover that calculation had its limits when the person across the table had spent 31 years on the other side of exactly this kind of conversation. "How much longer for the package?" I asked. "3 days," Alistair said. "4 at the outside. I want to make sure the transaction timeline is airtight before it goes to Reyes." "Take the 4, I said. "Do it right." "Always," he said. I ended the call and sat in the quiet study for a while. The evening had settled fully outside the neighborhood, dark and still. The oak trees just visible shapes against the lighter sky. The bird feeder a small shadow on its post in the yard. I thought about Serena sitting on Ruth's sofa with her rehearsed warmth and her bottle of wine and her questions disguised as concern. And I thought about the specific quality of her silence when I said Marcus Telle's name. And I thought about the 3 seconds it had taken her to recover. 3 seconds. In my experience, that was the difference between a person who had nothing to hide and a person who had everything to hide, but was very good at hiding it. She was good. I would not pretend otherwise. She was composed and intelligent and practiced in the particular skill of managing how she appeared to the people around her. Under other circumstances, against someone less prepared to receive her, the approach she had taken tonight might have worked, but she had sat across from the wrong man. She had sat across from a man who had spent 3 decades watching people exactly like her, who had learned to read the 3-second silence and the micro-shift behind the eyes and the warmth that required effort to maintain its temperature. She had sat across from a man who had already locked away the things she came for and was now simply waiting for the machinery of consequence to do what machinery of consequence does when it is properly assembled and set in motion. She had come to take the temperature. What she had not understood was that by coming, she had given me something more valuable than anything she could have learned. She had confirmed that she was afraid. And afraid people, in my experience, made mistakes. The package went to Agent Reyes on a Friday morning. Alistair called me at 8:45 to tell me it had been transmitted, a secure digital transfer through a channel his contact had provided, accompanied by a physical copy that Alistair had driven to the field office himself the previous afternoon, and left with the front desk addressed to Reyes directly. He had not wanted to rely solely on digital transmission for something of this weight. That was Alistair redundant by design, because redundancy was what you did when the thing you were sending mattered enough to make absolutely certain it arrived. She acknowledged receipt, he said. Both copies. How did she sound, I asked. Interested, he said. She asked 2 questions before she even finished reading the cover summary. That's a good sign. I had learned to trust Alistair's read of people over 19 years of working beside him. He was not a man who offered reassurance carelessly. If he said interested, he meant something specific by it, not polite interest. Not the performative engagement of a bureaucrat going through motions, but the particular quality of attention that a seasoned investigator brings to a case that has real substance. What did she ask? I said. She asked how the veteran in the Gastonia transaction was recruited, he said. And she asked whether there was any documentation of financial transfers between Marcus Telle and the veterans whose names appeared on the applications. Both were exactly the right questions. They were the questions I would have asked. They told me that Reyes had looked at the pattern and understood immediately where the pressure points were. The recruited veterans were potentially victims as much as participants. Depending on what they had been told and what they had been paid. And the money trail between Tele and those individuals would be the thread that, if located, would tie the whole scheme together with the kind of financial specificity that federal prosecutors needed to build a case that held. "We don't have the transfer documentation," I said. "No," Alistair said. "That's their job now." That was the correct way to think about it. We had done what we could do as private individuals operating within the bounds of what was appropriate and legal. We had identified the pattern, documented the connections, assembled the chronology, and delivered it to the people with the authority and the tools to take it the rest of the way. Subpoenaing financial records, interviewing the veterans, executing search warrants on tele-advisory groups' records. Those were federal investigative actions that required federal authority. We had given them the map. The excavation was theirs. I thanked Alistair and told him I would be in touch. Then I sat in the study for a long time without doing anything in particular. This was the moment I had been building toward for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of early mornings and legal pads and phone calls and documents and the quiet, steady work of a man who knew how to do this and had done it carefully and thoroughly and without letting emotion make him careless. The machine was in motion now. It was no longer in my hands. That was the right outcome. I knew it was the right outcome. And yet there was something about the transition from active work to waiting that required its own kind of adjustment. I had always been better at doing than at waiting. Ruth used to say that patience was my weakest virtue, which coming from Ruth was a specific kind of observation, because Ruth's weakest virtue was still better than most people's strongest. She was not wrong about it, though. I had learned patience as a professional discipline, but it had always required more effort from me than action did. I got up from the desk and went to the kitchen and made a fresh pot of coffee, even though it was past 10 in the morning, and I had already had 2 cups. Then I took the coffee to the back porch and sat in Ruth's rocking chair and looked at the garden. The garden was doing well this spring, better than last year, when I had still been learning which plants were which and had made several well-intentioned errors that Ruth would have caught immediately and corrected without making me feel foolish about them. This year the azaleas along the back fence had come in full, and the knockout roses Ruth had planted 6 years ago were showing their first buds, and the small herb section near the gate rosemary, thyme. One determined basil plant was growing with more confidence than I had expected, given my limited horticultural experience. I had learned the garden the way I had learned most things in my life methodically, from books and from observation, making notes, correcting errors, not expecting to be good at it before I had put in the time required to be good at it. Ruth had been the natural gardener. She had that quality that certain people have with growing things, an intuitive understanding of what a plant needed that went beyond what any book could teach. I did not have that quality, but I had persistence, and persistence, it turned out, was enough to keep a garden alive, if not quite enough to make it what Ruth's hands had made it. I thought about Derek while I sat there. I had not spoken to him since the lunch on Central Avenue, which was now more than 3 weeks ago. The silence between us had taken on a different quality since then, not the silence of avoidance, the way it had felt before the lunch, but something more like the silence of 2 people who have said something true to each other and are now living with what was said. Derek had told me he had made choices, that he had gone along with things he should have pushed back on. He had not told me everything. I did not think he was capable of telling me everything yet. Not while Serena was still the primary presence in his daily life, and the fear of consequence was still an abstraction rather than a reality. But he had told me something, and something, in my experience, was always the beginning of more. What came next for Derek was going to depend significantly on what choices he made in the weeks ahead. Federal investigators, when they moved on a case of this kind, did not move only against the most visible participants. They followed the money and the connections wherever they led. And the connections led to Derek's name on the mortgage of a house financed through fraudulent VA claims. His culpability would be assessed in light of what he knew, when he knew it, and whether he chose cooperation or obstruction when the moment of choice arrived. I could not make that choice for him. I had never been able to make choices for Derek, not since he was old enough to make them himself. That was one of the hardest lessons of parenthood, the recognition that your child's choices are ultimately theirs, that your influence has limits no matter how much you love them, and that the best thing you can do is be the kind of person they can return to when the choices go wrong. I intended to be that person. My phone buzzed on the small table beside the rocking chair. I looked at the screen. It was a text from Derek. 3 words. Can we talk? Not a question mark. Derek had never been good with punctuation in text messages, which was a small and irrelevant observation, but the kind that the mind offers in moments of significance, reaching for the ordinary when the extraordinary is too large to meet directly. I looked at those 3 words for a moment. Then I typed back, yes. Come by whenever you're ready. I set the phone down and looked at the garden. The rosemary near the gate was catching the morning light in a way that made it look silver at the tips. Ruth had always loved rosemary. She said it smelled like something that had been alive a long time and intended to keep going. I understood that better now than I had when she said it. Derek arrived at 7 that evening. I heard his truck in the driveway, a different sound from Serena's car. Heavier and less precise. The particular sound of a vehicle that had been chosen for utility rather than impression. I had always liked that about Derek's truck. It was an honest vehicle. It did not pretend to be something it was not. I opened the door before he knocked. He looked worse than he had at the barbecue place 3 weeks ago. The tiredness I had noticed then had deepened into something that sat closer to the surface now, in the set of his shoulders, in the quality of his eyes, in the way he moved through the door with the careful deliberateness of a man carrying something heavy and trying not to let it show. He had not shaved in several days. He was wearing a work shirt with the collar open and jeans that had seen better days. And he was carrying nothing, no jacket, no phone visible. Nothing in his hands, as if he had left the house quickly and without preparation. I stepped aside to let him in and led him to the kitchen. I made coffee without asking whether he wanted any, because Derek had been drinking coffee since he was 17 years old, and because doing something with my hands while we found our way into the conversation seemed like the right instinct. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had done his arithmetic homework at 9, where he had sat the week his mother was diagnosed, and he put his forearms on the table and looked at his hands. I set a cup in front of him and sat down across from him with my own. We were quiet for a moment. The kitchen clock made its small sound. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the evening had gone dark and quiet. The neighborhood settled into itself the way it did at this hour. Derek looked up. "She knows you're investigating," he said. "She told me about coming here Tuesday. She said you asked her about Marcus." "I did," I said. He nodded slowly. He looked back at his hands. "How much do you know?" "Enough," I said. "The VA financing on your house. The pattern across 4 properties. Marcus Telle's role in structuring the transactions. The prior relationship between Marcus and Serena." I paused. "The timeline of that relationship relative to your marriage." Something moved across his face when I said that last part. Something that was pain, and something that was shame, and something that might have been underneath both of those. A complicated kind of relief, the relief that comes when the thing you have been carrying alone is finally acknowledged by someone else. Even when the acknowledgement hurts. "I didn't know all of it," he said. "When it started. I want you to understand that. Tell me what you did know," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he began to talk. What Derek told me over the next 40 minutes was not a confession in the legal sense. He was careful, in the way that even non-lawyers are careful when they sense that the words they are choosing are words that might matter later in ways they cannot fully predict. But it was honest in the way that mattered to me as his father, which was the way that counted most in that kitchen on that evening. He had known, from early in the mortgage process on the Hartwell Crossing house, that the financing was not conventional. Serena had explained it to him as a specialized program, a benefit structure that Marcus had identified, and that was available to them through a connection Marcus had with a veteran who was, in Serena's framing, a business partner. Derek had asked questions, not enough questions, and not the right questions. But he had asked. Serena had answered in the way she answered everything fluently, confidently, with enough detail to satisfy the surface of the inquiry without ever quite addressing the substance beneath it. He had told himself it was legitimate because he wanted it to be legitimate. Because the house was beautiful and the life they were building in it felt like the life he had always wanted, and because Serena was certain in a way that made uncertainty feel unnecessary. He had moved the line, incrementally, the way I had described to myself 3 weeks ago, and by the time he understood enough to know that what was happening was not legitimate, by the time the understanding became something he could no longer avoid, he was already inside it, already a name on a document, already a resident of a house whose foundation, legally speaking, was built on something false. He had not known about the other 3 properties until approximately 6 months ago, when he had overheard a phone conversation between Serena and Marcus that had made the scope of what they were doing impossible to continue misunderstanding. He had confronted Serena after that call. She had been calm and practical about it, in the way she was calm and practical about everything, acknowledging enough to prevent outright denial while framing what she acknowledged in terms that minimized its significance. "People do this all the time," she had told him. "The program has gaps. Marcus knows how to work within them. Nobody is getting hurt." He had chosen to believe her. Or rather, he had chosen to act as if he believed her, which is a different thing and a worse one. And I thought he understood that distinction, even if he had not articulated it in those terms. When she came home Tuesday night, Derek said, after she'd been here, she was different. Quiet in a way she doesn't usually get quiet. She was on her phone for most of the evening, and she didn't tell me who she was talking to, and I didn't ask. He looked up at me. I think she's talking to Marcus about what to do. Probably, I said. Oh, Dad. He said it the way he had said it when he was a boy, and something was beyond him, not as a request for rescue, but as a reaching toward presence. What's going to happen? I looked at my son across the kitchen table. I thought about what to say to him carefully, because what I said in this moment was going to be one of the things he carried forward, regardless of how everything else resolved. I did not want to give him comfort that was not honest. I did not want to give him harshness that was not useful. I wanted to give him the truth in the form that would serve him best. A federal investigation is going to begin, I said. It may have already begun. You're going to be contacted, Derek. And when you are contacted, the most important thing you can do, the only thing that will serve you in the way that matters, is to tell the truth. Everything you know, everyone you know it about, without holding anything back and without trying to protect anyone who does not deserve to be protected. He looked at me steadily. Including Serena, I said. He was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen clock made its sound. The refrigerator hummed. I still love her, he said. And the way he said it, not as a defense, not as an excuse, but as a simple statement of a fact that was causing him significant pain, made it one of the most honest things I had heard him say in years. I know, I said. That doesn't change what needs to happen. He nodded. He looked at his coffee cup. He was quiet for a while longer. Then he said, Was it planned from the beginning? Was she looking for someone like me specifically? I don't know, I said. That's the honest answer. What I know is that it doesn't change your situation or your choices. Whatever her intentions were, the path forward is the same. He accepted that. He nodded once and looked at the table and was quiet. We sat together in the kitchen for another hour after that. Not talking about any of it, talking about other things, small things. The kind of conversation that had always been easier between us than the difficult kind. I told him about the garden. He told me about a property he had been working on before everything became complicated. A renovation project on a commercial building near Plaza Midwood that had interesting bones and a difficult owner. We talked the way fathers and sons talk, when they are sitting with something too large to keep discussing and need the relief of the ordinary for a while. When he stood to leave, he looked at me in the hallway with an expression that I recognized from his childhood, the expression of a boy who had made a mistake and knew it, and was trying to find his way back from it without knowing quite which direction back was. I put my hand on his shoulder briefly. Whatever you decide, I said, come back here. That doesn't change. He nodded. He could not quite speak. He went out to his truck, and I stood in the doorway and watched the taillights until they turned at the end of Pembroke Lane and disappeared. Then I went inside and locked the door and stood in the hallway of the house that was safe, now protected, documented, beyond reach, and I let myself feel, for the first time since this had all begun, the full weight of what it meant to love a person and still hold them accountable. To refuse to look away from what they had done, not in spite of loving them, but because of it. Ruth had known how to do that more gracefully than I did. I was learning it at 68. Better late than not at all, I supposed. I turned off the hallway light and went to bed. The formal charges came on a Thursday morning in late June. Alistair called me before I had finished my first cup of coffee, 6:58. The timer on the Mr. Coffee machine still ticking down its last few minutes. I was standing at the kitchen counter when the phone rang. Still in my robe. The morning light coming through the window above the sink at the angle that in summer turned the kitchen briefly gold before it moved on. "It's official," Alistair said. "Marcus Telle. 4 counts of wire fraud. 2 counts of making false statements to a federal agency. 1 count of conspiracy to defraud the United States." The press release went out 20 minutes ago. I set my coffee cup on the counter. "Oh, Serena," I said, "show 2 counts of wire fraud. 1 count of conspiracy." Alistair said. Her attorney negotiated the scope down in exchange for cooperation. She gave them Marcus. The full picture, the recruitment of the veterans, the fee structure, the transaction methodology, everything. I was quiet for a moment. "Derek," I said. "No charges," Alistair said. His cooperation was complete, and his exposure, in Briggs's framing, was characterized as knowing participation without initiating intent. The prosecutors accepted that characterization. He'll likely face civil liability related to the property restitution to the VA program, but no criminal charges. I leaned against the counter and looked at the window. The yard was fully bright now, the gold having moved on as it always did, the morning settling into its ordinary self. The bird feeder had 3 visitors, 2 sparrows and the cardinal, who came most mornings and whom I had taken to thinking of, in the private way that people develop private understandings with the small creatures that share their space, as something like a regular. No criminal charges. I let those words sit for a moment and felt what they felt like. What they felt like was not triumph, and not vindication, and not the particular satisfaction that people in crime dramas seem to feel when the verdict goes the right way. What they felt like was quiet. A specific kind of quiet that is different from the absence of sound, a quiet that is the presence of something settled, something that has been uncertain for a long time and has finally found its ground. Derek was going to be all right, not immediately, not without difficulty and cost, and the long work of rebuilding a life on a foundation that had turned out to be different from what he had believed it to be. There was the civil liability Alistair had mentioned, which would be real and would take time to resolve. There was the apartment on the east side of Charlotte, modest and adequate and nothing like the life he had been living. There was the marriage that was, in every practical sense, over the paperwork not yet filed, but the reality already established in the moment Serena had walked out of the house in Hartwell Crossing without looking back. There was the long work of becoming, again, the man he had been before, or rather, not the man he had been before, because that man had made the choices that had led here, but a better version. A man who had looked at what he had allowed and had chosen differently when choosing differently was hard and costly and required him to stand without the structure that had been holding him up. That work was his. I could not do it for him, but I could be present for it, and I intended to be. I thanked Alistair. I told him that what he had done, the weeks of methodical work, the careful assembly of the package, the relationship with Reyes that had made it possible to put the right information in the right hands, had mattered in ways that went beyond anything I could adequately express over a phone call. He told me, in the way Alistair told things without sentiment, but with complete sincerity that it had been the right thing to do, and that doing the right thing was its own sufficient reason. We said we would have dinner soon. We had been saying that for 2 years, and had managed it approximately 3 times, which, given our respective schedules and the distance between Charlotte and Richmond, was probably about right. I intended to make it 4 times before the year was out. I ended the call and stood at the kitchen counter for a little while longer. Then I went to the study. I sat down behind the desk, and I opened the top left drawer, and I took out Ruth's savings ledger, and I set it on the desk in front of me. And then, for the first time since the week after the funeral, I opened it. Her handwriting was on every page, small, precise, slightly left-leaning, the handwriting of a woman who had learned penmanship in a school that still taught it as a discipline, and who had maintained it throughout her life as a matter of respect for the reader. The entries were dated and neat. Deposit amounts and running totals, and the occasional note in the margin, a reminder to herself, or an observation, or once, near the entry for a deposit that had brought them past a particular milestone. A small drawing of a house that was clearly meant to represent the one they were saving toward, rendered with more enthusiasm than artistic skill, and all the more dear for it. I turned the pages slowly. 6 years of deposits. 6 years of choosing the practical thing over the appealing thing. 6 years of Ruth tracking every dollar with the same patience and precision she brought to everything she cared about, which was most things, which was one of the qualities about her that I had loved most and recognized most clearly only in its absence. Near the back of the ledger, a few pages before the entries stopped at the point where they had reached the down payment amount and the saving had been complete. There was a note in the margin that I had not seen before. Or perhaps I had seen it years ago and forgotten. Or perhaps I had not been ready to see it when it was first there to be read. It said, in Ruth's small, precise handwriting, "We did it the right way." 5 words. I looked at them for a long time. We did it the right way. It was such a Ruth thing to write. Not "we did it," which would have been sufficient. Not "look how far we've come," which would have been celebratory in the obvious way. We did it the right way. As if the manner of the achievement were as important as the achievement itself. As if the path you took to a thing were part of the thing you arrived at. As if integrity were not just a value you held, but a record you kept. Legible in the way you had done everything that mattered. I sat with those 5 words for a while. Then I closed the ledger carefully and put it back in the drawer. I picked up the Parker pen from the corner of the desk, where it had been resting since the day the trust was executed. I held it the way Ruth had held it, the barrel worn smooth on one side from her grip, and I thought about her signing the mortgage in 1992 with the pen she had accidentally kept from the real estate agent and laughed about for a week. The house was still here, protected, safe, documented in an irrevocable trust that bore Derek's name as beneficiary, and that no court action, no fraudulent claim, no document pushed across a table with 2 practiced fingers could touch. We had done it the right way. I set the pen down and went to the kitchen and poured a fresh cup of coffee and carried it to the back porch and sat in Ruth's rocking chair and looked at the garden in the morning light. The knockout roses she had planted 6 years ago were fully open now, deep pink, almost red at the center. The kind of color that looks like it is lit from inside. I had been watching them work toward this for weeks, the buds forming, tightening, The first cautious opening, and now here they were, fully themselves, taking up their rightful space in the morning without apology or qualification. Ruth would have been pleased with them. I thought about Derek, across the city in his modest apartment, waking up to a Thursday morning that was going to bring him the news that Alistair had just brought me. Briggs would call him, or perhaps he had already called. Derek would sit with it the way he sat with things quietly, needing time, working through what it meant and what came next. He would call me eventually, maybe today, maybe tomorrow. When he was ready, I would be here. That was the thing about fixed points. They do not move to meet you. They wait for you to find your way back to them. That is what makes them fixed. The weeks that followed moved at their own pace. Federal investigations do not unfold on the schedule of the people waiting at the edges of them. I had known that from 31 years of professional experience, had known it intellectually, in the way you know things that you have observed from a position of relative distance, knowing it personally, as the man sitting in the rocking chair on the back porch waiting for news that came when it came and not before, was a different kind of knowing, more patient, more humble, more aware of the limits of what any individual could control once the larger machinery was in motion. Alistair called every few days with what he could piece together from his contact with Reyes. Marcus Telle had retained a defense attorney within hours of his initial questioning and had declined to cooperate with investigators in any voluntary capacity. That was not surprising. A man who had spent years constructing careful distance between himself and the visible transactions was not going to abandon that carefulness at the first sign of federal attention. He would make them prove everything. That was his right, and the investigators had anticipated it. What Alistair understood was that the search of the Telle Advisory Group offices had yielded documentation substantial enough that the question was not whether charges would be filed, but when and how many. Serena had retained Marcus's recommended attorney, as Derek had observed. What her legal strategy was, beyond retaining counsel, Alistair did not know. What he did know was that the investigators had subpoenaed financial records connected to the Hartwell Crossing property and the 3 prior transactions, and that those records were in the process of being assembled and reviewed. The veterans whose names had appeared on the applications had been contacted. 2 of them, according to what Alistair had been able to gather, had agreed to speak with investigators. That was significant. Those conversations, if they produced what the investigators likely hoped they would produce, would provide the human testimony to accompany the documentary evidence, the specific individuals who had been approached, what they had been told, what they had been paid, and by whom. Derek had retained an attorney, a former federal prosecutor named Harlan Briggs, whom Beaumont had recommended and whom I had spoken with briefly on the phone before Derek's first meeting with him. Briggs was methodical and direct and did not traffic in false comfort. He had told Derek, in terms that were clear and honest, that his exposure was real but manageable, and that the single most effective thing he could do for his own situation was to be fully and proactively cooperative with the investigation. Derek had chosen cooperation. He had told me this in a phone call the week after his evening at Pembroke Lane, and the way he said it, not with the relief of someone who had found an easy way out, but with the particular steadiness of someone who had made a difficult decision and intended to stand behind it, had told me more about where he was in himself than anything else he could have said. I was proud of him for it. I did not say that in the moment, because it was not the moment for that kind of statement. Derek needed support, not praise. And there is a difference between those things that matters, especially when a person is in the middle of something hard. But I felt it, and I intended to find the right moment for it eventually. When the circumstances made it possible to say without it sounding like a verdict on all the things that had come before it. Derek had moved out of the Hartwell Crossing house in the second week after Serena's interview. He was staying in a short-term rental apartment on the east side of Charlotte that was modest and adequate and entirely unlike the house in Hartwell Crossing in every measurable way. He had called it fine when I asked, which in Derek's vocabulary meant it was hard, but he was managing, which was the most I could have hoped for at that stage. We had dinner together twice in those weeks, once at a restaurant on Central Avenue near the barbecue place, once at Pembroke Lane where I made the chicken and vegetables that had been one of Ruth's standard Wednesday dinners, and that I had learned to make adequately, if not beautifully, in the years since her passing. Both evenings were quieter than our old Sunday calls had ever been, and truer. And I found something in that shift, the movement from performed normalcy to actual presence that felt like the beginning of something real between us that the previous year had been preventing. Loss has a way of clearing ground, if you let it. Not the loss of catastrophe only, but the smaller losses too, the loss of illusion, the loss of comfortable distance, the loss of the easy version of a relationship that has been substituting for the honest version. Derek and I had been doing the easy version for too long. His mother's death had begun to change that. And then the circumstances of recent months had accelerated the change in ways that were painful and necessary, and ultimately, I believed, valuable. I was sitting with all of that on the porch one evening when my phone buzzed on the small table beside the rocking chair, a text from a number I did not recognize. I looked at it for a moment, then opened it. It was from Serena. 4 words. I'm sorry. Walter. Truly. I looked at those 4 words for a long time. I did not know what had prompted them, whether it was something that had happened in the legal proceedings, whether her attorney had advised it, whether it was genuine or strategic or some combination of both that she herself could not fully separate. I did not know whether the apology was for the property transfer document specifically, or for the larger scheme, or for the years of performance that had substituted for honesty in every room she had ever shared with my family. I thought about what Ruth would have done with those 4 words. Ruth was a woman who believed in forgiveness as a practice, rather than a feeling, not the kind of forgiveness that required you to pretend something had not happened, but the kind that required you to release the weight of it for your own sake rather than for the sake of the person who had caused the harm. She had talked about it once, after a difficult situation with a colleague of hers that I had watched her work through over the course of a year. And what she had said was this: forgiveness is not a door you open for someone else. It is a door you open for yourself. The other person doesn't even have to know you opened it. I sat with Serena's 4 words for a while longer. Then I set the phone down on the small table beside the rocking chair without responding. Not because the words meant nothing. Not because I intended to carry the weight of what she had done indefinitely, which would have served no one and least of all me, but because the response, if there was one, was not something I was ready to give yet, and because some doors you open quietly and in your own time, and without announcing it to anyone. The morning dove was in the oak tree, the garden was growing, the evening was warm and still, I did not hear from Derek that Thursday. He called on Friday morning, just after 8, while I was in the garden. I had taken to bringing my phone with me when I went out there, a habit I had developed over the past months. During the period when calls had mattered and timing had mattered, and I had not wanted to miss the moment when something important arrived. I heard the phone and pulled off one glove and answered. "Briggs called yesterday," Derek said. "I know you know." "Alistair told me," I said. No charges," he said. The way he said it was not relief exactly, or not only relief. It was the sound of a man who understood that what he had been given was not absolution, but an opportunity, and who felt the weight of the difference between those two things. "No charges," I said. We were quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about Mom," he said. "So have I," said. I keep thinking about what she would say. About all of it. About what I did and what you did and everything." He paused. "I think she would be harder on me than you've been. Your mother was patient in ways I am not," I said. "But she believed in consequences. She always did." "Yeah," he said. "She did." Another silence. A comfortable one, the kind that had begun to return to our conversations in recent weeks. The kind that does not need to be filled because it is not empty. "I want to come by this weekend," Derek said. "Help in the garden, if that's all right." I looked at the rosemary near the gate, silver in the morning light. I looked at Ruth's roses, fully open, deep pink against the green of the fence. "That's more than all right," I said. He came on Saturday. We spent most of the morning outside. I showed him what needed doing, and he did it without complaint and with more competence than I had expected. Which should not have surprised me, since Ruth had gardened with him every spring until he was old enough to decide he had other things to do with Saturday mornings. The knowledge had apparently persisted even through the years of neglect. We had lunch at the kitchen table. Sandwiches and iced tea. Simple and adequate. The kind of meal that does not require much thought to prepare and does not demand anything of the people eating it except presence. After lunch, Derek sat for a while without moving to leave, and I sat across from him, and we talked about things that had nothing to do with any of it, about a book I had been reading, about a project at his new job that was beginning to interest him, about a memory of Ruth that had surfaced for him during the week. One of those small, specific memories that grief surfaces without warning. A detail so particular that it could only be true. When he finally stood to leave, he stood in the hallway for a moment and looked at the house the way people look at places they are returning to after a long absence, taking in the familiar things, the arrangement of them, the quality of light they live in. "It looks the same," he said. "It is the same," I said. He nodded. He seemed to find something in that. I walked him out to the truck, and we said our goodbyes with the ease of people who have relearned each other and are no longer working as hard at it as they were. He drove away, and I stood in the driveway for a moment and listened to the quiet that followed. Then I went inside. I went to the study and I sat behind the desk, and I looked at the Parker pen on the corner and at the legal pad that still sat where I had left it. The last page filled with the last notes I had written the night Derek came to tell me about Serena walking out without looking back. I looked at the date at the top of the first page, the date I had written the morning after the call to Alistair, neat and precise, the way I had always begun every case file. I picked up the pen, I opened the legal pad to a fresh page, and I wrote, in the same deliberate handwriting I had used for 31 years of case notes. A single line. Case closed. Then I set the pen down and closed the legal pad and sat in the quiet of the study for a while. Outside. The afternoon was moving through its hours the way afternoons do, unhurried, indifferent to urgency, proceeding according to its own understanding of what time is for. The cardinal was at the bird feeder. The roses were open along the fence. The oak trees were doing their slow and ancient work of growing, adding another season's worth of ring beneath the bark, keeping their own record of the years in the way that living things keep records not in writing, but in accumulation. I thought about Ruth one more time. Not with grief, exactly, though grief was always present somewhere in the thinking of her, the way a scar is always present even when it no longer hurts. I thought about her with something closer to gratitude for the 39 years, for the savings ledger, for the pink azaleas and the Parker pen and the 5 words in the margin that I had finally been ready to read, for the person she had made me more of, by being the person she was, consistently and without calculation, for every year I had known her, for the standard she had set that I had been trying to meet, in my imperfect and methodical way, ever since. We did it the right way. I was going to carry those words for the rest of my life, not as a burden, as a compass. The coffee was still warm. I picked up the cup and took the last of it and set the cup down and looked out the study window at the afternoon, which was gold now, the light making its slow way through the oak leaves, the way it had been making its way through them every afternoon for 32 years, giving the yard the quality of something remembered even while it was happening. I was 68 years old, sitting in a study full of books and filing cabinets and the accumulated evidence of a life lived carefully and not without cost. I had a son who was finding his way back from something difficult, and a garden that needed tending, and a pension that was solid, and a house that was safe, and an old friend in Richmond who I owed a dinner. I had Ruth's pen on my desk, and her handwriting in my drawer, and her roses in my yard, and her voice in my memory, clear as it had always been, telling me things I was still in the process of fully understanding. That was enough. More than enough. That was in the accounting that mattered. Everything. If this story found its way to you today, if something in Walter's voice felt familiar, or if the garden and the kitchen table and the weight of loving someone through their mistakes reminded you of something in your own life, then I am glad it reached you. We all have a house worth protecting. We all have a version of that Parker pen, something we carry, because it connects us to someone we loved and do not want to forget. And most of us, at one point or another, have had to choose between the easy path and the true one. I hope you choose the true one. I hope you always have someone like Alistair in your corner. And I hope the roses in your yard come in full this spring, the way Ruth's always did. If this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a like if Walter's voice stayed with you. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories. Like this one, stories about real life, real choices, and the quiet kind of courage that does not make the news, but makes all the difference. God bless you, and thank you for listening.